We did approximately 60 messages for the first part, and that was the political backgrounds. We won't even do a third of that, 20 messages for the social background. That'll be our smallest section, and you can see it's the smallest here on the outline. We're on the very bottom of page 3. The top of page 4 has the rest of social backgrounds. And then we'll crank it up again for a long study. I don't know exactly how long it'll be. It may be another 60 messages to finish the religious backgrounds. We have that broken down into 2 sections there. A, paganism, the occult, the pantheons, the emperor worship, mystery religions, and the philosophies. Some of these things we've touched on in other studies, like Plato, Gnosticism a little bit, the Stoics, Epicureans, and Christian ethics, but we'll probably look at it a little more and from a different point of view now. We're studying it historically. And then the big section will be Judaism. And I don't know how far we're going to go, how deep we're going to go in this, because Judaism, well, I don't know. We may have to study it here. It really does fit in the intertestamental period class. It could be a class in itself, a class by itself, just a study of Judaism. But it does fit here well, maybe not bringing it up into current times and current years, but since it does basically develop in the period between the Testaments, it's not even really there. It's not even really to be seen in the pages of the Old. However, whenever you open up the New Testament, there's this highly structured, organized form of Jewish faith and Jewish religion, which is not seen in the Old Testament. So it does develop in the period between the 2 Testaments, and that may necessitate us taking a look at it in more detail than I had thought that we would. Even if we don't do that, and my outline had not planned looking that deeply into it, the outline does, however, touch on all the important things. Changes which occurred during the period, number 2, examples of these changes. And here are the important changes. The diaspora, what that means, Hebraism versus Hellenism, the Samaritans. See, we have everything covering there: the origin of the city, the region, the people, post-exilic Samaritan dilemma, the New Testament usage of the Jewish-Samaritan rivalry, the Samaritan place of worship, Moses' predictions in Deuteronomy. Some of that's been covered in biblical literature concerning the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is the only portion of Bible that they have is the Pentateuch. But sections like Deuteronomy 12 have been slightly edited and rewritten. The Samaritan reversal of these predictions, which says just what I said. The Samaritan temple, its rise and fall. We go back to John Hyrcanus, who was the one who destroyed the temple in the 2nd century B.C. We discussed that in the political backgrounds to the period between the Testaments. And then you get the case of John chapter 4. The monarchy, we'll discuss the importance. A lot of this will have to be saved for Old Testament theology. But the monarchy, the importance of kingship in Israel's thought. The temple, Babylonian captivity, the post-exilic times, Cyrus' decree, Zerubbabel, Haggai, Zechariah, temple reference in the Talmud, Maccabean ruin and restoration. Then Herod's temple, its expansion, its destruction, its characteristics, the various courts, the ritual, and the police force. And the synagogue, history, purpose, officials, ruler, minister, order of the service, the Christian importance of the early New Testament synagogues. Things like James 2 would point that out, as well as the book of Acts. Priests, see, that a lot of that's Old Testament theology, so I don't know how much we're going to study that. Things like Samaritans, hopefully we can be fairly exhaustive there. The scribes, the study of prophets, that's a whole study in itself. Jewish religious sects, now we will do a lot in that because that really doesn't fit anywhere else, but specifically here. In other words, some things are more immediately connected to the Old Testament, such as the subject of priests. That's more immediately connected to the Old Testament and to its ritual and liturgy and theology than it is the period between the Testaments. Scribes, that'd be a different matter. They're more loosely attached to the Old than are the priests. But these Jewish religious sects don't even exist in Old Testament times, so they'll have to be studied in detail. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and so forth. And I don't think that we all want to study that literature again, the Septuagint, the Apocrypha, and the Pseudepigrapha. That's just attached on for completeness' sake. I make up one of these studies, and I never know which one's going to beat the other one in looking at it. Whichever one beats it, that makes the other one already been covered, outdated by the time we get there. which is some of what we're having to do right now. Before throwing it away, where are we? The bottom of the page, economically, bottom of page 3. Since we'll be looking at this in a lot of detail later on, we'll just give you some brief things, introducing you to recession, inflation, and industry, and agriculture, and things like that as we see here. I don't know if we'll get any further than just be economically. We've got socially, economically, top of page 4, culturally. So we'll look at what I have written there: occupations, industry, agriculture, and finance. We just introduce ourselves to that, and we'll study that in more detail at a later time. Okay, let's begin with the working world then in the 1st century A.D. Of course, we're going to have to go back to Old Testament to get some references, because the times in that regard are not changing very much. Now, the religious scene and sphere, as well as the political sphere, changes quite a bit. You're seeing that we're in the social era. You can notice on the outline, this is just really self-evident there. The smallest section has been devoted to the social backgrounds of the period between the Testament, in contrast or in comparison with the political and with the religious backgrounds. Why? Politics, they change in any era. They change rapidly and quickly. Religious movements and leaders and thoughts and events, they change rapidly and quickly as well. As far as socially, as far as the people are concerned, their means and methods and ways and manners and customs, well, that's going to stay fairly constant all through the Old Testament. It's not until fairly recent times where things change so rapidly, even in areas like that. And some of what we'll have to say tonight will have to be based upon that. We live in such a, since we're speaking economically tonight, we live in such an advanced society, economically speaking, where things change so rapidly. Where back in those days it was a more easygoing, easy-coming, easy-going way of life, and things just didn't change. What did change, the changes were caused by the introduction of Roman intervention into the life of the Jews in the land of Palestine. So we've already looked at things like taxation, which would also have to be covered here under an economic study of the period between the Testaments. But as far as occupations, I mean, just think in the last 100 years, the various new occupations that have arisen that could not have even existed any time prior to that. Whereas if you're just a farmer or a fisherman, it's just farming and fishing for hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of years. That just essentially doesn't change. Now we have different ways of doing it, but farming and fishing stay the same. If you're studying it today, now you're going to study the change of the means and methods of it. Back then it just doesn't change though. You have no automation. You have no industrial revolution. You have no gasoline or steam power. We can even go back to the steam days. Steam-powered engines. We don't have any of that. We just have man, his arms, his legs, his back, and his trusted animals, his donkey or his ox or his cattle. And that's not going to change as the years roll by, whether in the Old Testament or in the New. So let's start, first of all, with the subject of industry and agriculture. We'll kind of divide it up looking at industry and agriculture and looking at the Roman world. Now, more than half of the Roman Empire's population, more than half, were slaves, remember. They just did whatever their master's bidding was. They didn't really have any choice. And really, being a slave sometimes was better off. Being a poor slave was many times better than being a poor free man, because at least you were guaranteed food and shelter. Perhaps something that's frequently overlooked as far as the subject of slavery is concerned, something being so degrading. But to be a slave was to be guaranteed food and shelter. You're no good to your master starving, naked, or dead, that's for sure. He's going to make sure that you're fed, that you're clothed, that you have the basic essentials of life. Now, for a poor free man who is not a slave, therefore who, let's say 90% or more of the time had no employer, they just didn't have employers, you were always self-employed with just a marginal number of people working for someone else, maybe 10, 5%, something like that. Well, that means you have to fend for yourself then. You were on your own then. No one to watch over you, no one to guarantee. Not that an employer does, but at least if you're a slave and you're bound to that person almost eternally, at least as long as you're here in the body, he's going to make sure you have a place to stay and make sure you're going to have food for your stomach, or you're of no value and you're of no good to him. What about the subject of recession and inflation? They had that in those days? Well, like I said before, I don't make any claims of being an anthropologist. I don't make any claims being a political scientist. I don't make any claims to being a professional financier. But it is interesting how just because we live in a day and age where it seems like recession, inflation, those terms are just common everyday terms, where almost a 10-year-old knows the terms and understands the terms, and we tend to think that we read our history into ancient history then. We tend to think that, well, back in those days, of course, without stock market, without OPEC considerations, without these things, there's no way they could have had recessions or inflations in. And by the way, you realize that we're kind of coming out of a little recession right now in this country. We praise God for that. Although all you have to do is open the newspaper and read those left-wing liberals, and they always say, yes, we're coming out of it, but we may go in it again tomorrow. You're always worrying you about something. Instead of saying, praise God. They hate Reaganomics. Reaganomics stands for those on the right, and most of the media is on the left. And so the left-wing liberals in the media are always complaining if Reaganomics doesn't work, that it doesn't work, or if it does work, how long is it going to last, which is stupid as far as I'm concerned. Amen. We ought to rejoice in the present prosperity that we have. Amen. But yes, they didn't have fluctuations that were due to stocks or commodities or the organization of the petroleum exporting countries' considerations, which sometimes can take months and years. But they did have other reasons for recession and inflation. Let me give you a couple of those. First of all, and this ought to be the most obvious to you, the most important consideration for them and reason behind things such as recessions and inflation were what we would call climatic reasons. Since so much of society was agrarian-based, that is, based on agriculture, since so much of the society was agrarian-based, then the rising, the setting of the sun, and the coming of the showers from heaven or the withholding of them meant all the world to the people of the ancient world. It's interesting that in Matthew chapter 5, these two things happen to be mentioned by Jesus, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 45. We didn't get quite that far in our study the other morning in Christian ethics. We'll be back here, but look at Matthew 5:45. Why do you think he mentions these two things? He could have said that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven, for he maketh the stock of the evil to rise just like the good, and the price of petroleum to go down for the just like for the unjust. Well, that may not be a totally fair skip in culture from then until now, but notice he does pick out sun and rain. It was an agrarian society then. Not that this is unknown. This is well known by you people here and by anybody who just thinks about ancient history. But of course we fail to realize how important that is. We fail to realize just how important it was. It meant everything in the world to them. Of course it means a lot today, but not as much when you've got, what is it now, 5 billion bushels of grain that are still on reserve by the United States government. That'd feed 1 or 2 mouths for a couple of days, I'm sure. 5 billion bushels of grain still on reserve. And that doesn't count this bumper crop we're going to get this year from the Midwest, thanks to those states like Iowa and Minnesota and Illinois and Indiana. That ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. And here's a proof of his providential love, not his special love and election, but of his providential love. For he maketh his sun to rise. Instead of the stock market rise, he maketh his sun to rise. See, for today, if we're talking about people and their means and wherewithal, we'd have to be talking about more current things. And we wouldn't be talking about the sun and the rain. After all, we can almost, manufacture a sun today and manufacture rain, as it were. But not really. You know, if God ever wanted to send a drought, I mean, to this whole nation here, well, you could just wipe people off the face of the earth then. I mean, send a drought. There's no technology in the world that would ever overcome that. It's just that since we're so large, you got to think back in those days, everything is so small then. Since we're so large, he sends a drought down to the southeast. Well, the northeast will make up for the southeast, or the Midwest will make up for the southwest, or the northwest will make up for the Mississippi Valley. Some other part of the country will make up for another part. In those days, when you're just living in one little area, and you don't have trains and trucks and airplanes to bring you things, you starve to death then. You either take up the nomadic life and wander to where you can find food, which remember Abram did back in the book of Genesis. He wandered from a place of famine in Palestine down to Egypt where he could find food. You either wander or you just stay there and die. Now today, yes, we might have 5 billion bushels of wheat stored up, but if we had a drought that spread across this whole country from the New York Islands to the redwood forests, then this country is going to go under eventually, you see. It's going to tax the resources and tax the supplies here. You'd eat your 5 billion bushels. That's a lot, but we have a lot of people here in this country. And so other countries would supply for us. Well, what if God sent them a drought, though? Remember the book of Revelation. These things are going to happen. They're going to happen on a scale which has never been seen before. God could send a drought and a famine over, the Middle Eastern area, and really cause problems back there in the last few chapters of the book of Genesis. And hence we have Joseph and his wisdom and how he saved so many people then. But when we have it on such a wide-scale fashion as we're going to see it, according to the book of Revelation, there'll be no escaping God's judgment and God's punishment then. He maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and he sendeth his rain on the just and on the unjust. Now, for a farmer, that means everything in the world, even for a modern-day farmer. It hasn't changed. They need the sun and the rain, but it means everything in the world. Now, that might not mean so much to us because we don't grow our own food. And even if you grow your own food, some of you have some garden, how much do you really supply of your needs? I mean, come on, you supply so little of the vast things that you consume that are just lining your cupboard there, everything from cinnamon sugar to tang up there. And do you make all of that yourself? You make your own sugar yourself? You grow your own cinnamon yourself? You make your own tang yourself? Hardly. I mean, we grow a few vegetables. That's what it's called, vegetable gardens. That's what most Americans have. They grow a few vegetables. But think of the vast amount of ingredients that you women have in your cupboard that they didn't have in olden days. They had their spices, their meats, their vegetables, that's all. You don't have all of these other things. You've also got to buy bread. They made their bread then. You've got to buy Pop-Tarts. They made their Pop-Tarts then. You've got to buy crackers. I mean, think of all the bready things that you have in there, and muffins and rolls, and they made all of that. You go to the store and buy all of that. You pick out of the freezer ice cream and popsicles and frozen pizzas and all of these things. They didn't have to think about that back in those days. They needed some sun and some rain to grow those leeks and garlics and onions out there and to give them enough grass to fatten their cattle so they could slaughter them and eat them. We're in a different climate today, a different climate, economically speaking. So we're saying climatic reasons, such as, a few examples, Joseph in Egypt. We're talking about recession and inflation. We're talking about how they were living. Just try to picture it in a broad fashion. Someone living in the 1st century in Palestine, a Jew, the 1st century A.D. Recession, inflation. I mean, inflation's just the going up of prices, and something else such as a shortage generally causes that. And they could have shortages in those days just like we have in our day. And their shortages, most of the time, whenever they had one, their shortages were caused by climatic reasons, such as a famine or a drought that brings a famine. Generally, the drought comes first and the famine follows. Joseph in Egypt. Of course, there's a great famine in Egypt. But what causes a famine, though? A drought. What causes a drought? Not enough rain. We're back to rain right there. Not enough rain. Of course, then you can have the problem sometimes of too much rain. And too much rain will flood the crops out, and it will do just as much damage as not enough rain. But not enough rain means not enough grass. Not enough grass means not enough all of the other vegetables that could grow out there, and not enough grass means not enough animals because the animals don't have anything to eat. And so when you lose your animal food and you lose your vegetable food, then you lose your human life as well. Then in Acts chapter 11, we'll turn over here and look at this, verses 27 through 30. These things are fairly simple, but they're fairly interesting to understand as well. An importance existed behind things then that we generally don't consider today. I mean, let's be realistic while you're turning there, Acts 11. Even if a drought hit the Northeast, all of us have so much faith in the supermarkets. We're not really too concerned about who's going under or who's going over out there in the agrarian world as far as agriculture is concerned. We just know the supermarkets are stocked full, not only of different varieties of things, but of 14 different kinds of that same variety there. Right. Go try to pick out cereal. It's a nightmare to pick out cereal. Unless you get raised on something, Raisin Bran for us, and you just don't ever go away from it. And Special K, that's pretty good as well. You're raised on that, you stay with it. Otherwise, go and pick. And those alluring colors and those little Fruit Loops on that box, those things look good in there. They taste good too, but they're bad for you. In those days, there came some prophets from Jerusalem up to this new base of the church in Antioch. And there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there would come a great dearth, a famine, which would come about from a drought throughout all the world. Well, probably not Antarctica or Australia, but the part of the world that they were concerned about, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. And all it would have to be is just a small segment of territory, remember. And since you don't have trains and trucks and planes to ship things in, all it has to affect is a small area. And you just don't have time to get food in there to supply the people. The people, as I said, either die or they take up the nomadic lifestyle and they travel to the place where they can find food. And of course the problem with traveling is so many times you die on the way there, because you're also having to walk through parched lands where there's nothing to eat and where there's no water to drink. You know of the cases down in Africa now. These people march miles and miles to get to a place where they're going to get food, but so many just die on the way there. It's a terrible, tragic event that's taking place there. And we've got all this food in the world. All this food. Why don't we pack up those 5 billion bushels and just send them down there? We're such a Christian nation. Amen. Well, it just won't ever work. Things like that will never work, because as soon as that famine's over with, there'll be one in South America, and then there'll be one in China or India. So it would just never work. The world's too big today now. Everybody really has to take care of their own things. Okay, verse 29. Then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which dwelt in Judea, which also they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. Okay, I wonder what type of relief they're sending. Barnabas and Saul can't really pack too much on their back to carry down there, for a famine's going to strike the whole area here. Probably money. But why do you need money? Because the price of things, recession, inflation, the price of things will go up because there's a shortage. And what causes the shortage? Climatic reasons. A lack of sun, too much sun, a lack of rain, too much rain. Climatic reasons produce these problems. And so probably they are sending money so that food can be bought, because the price of food has gone up. So there's one reason behind recession and inflation in the first century. And they had it. I mean, every time you'd have a drought or famine of any significant proportion, you'd have recession and inflation on your hand. It would just happen that quickly. Because we're bombarded with these terms today, you've been brought up in the 60s and 70s and 80s, you're just bombarded, the 70s and 80s particularly, you're bombarded with these terms: inflation, 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 recession, recession, recession. And we forget that just skip back a couple of decades ago, we had a tremendous recession called a depression here in this country. It's not that it's anything new. And then all you've got to do is just jump back into history a little prior to that and jump back into the end of World War I, another recession then. And then jump back to the end of the Civil War, another recession, another period of inflation then. It's just because we are children of inflation. We are brought up on textbooks about inflation. We think that it affects us, but it's never affected our parents or grandparents or people in past history. And that's just not to look beyond the tip of your nose to think like that. As long as there's been mankind, there's been the problem of recession and inflation. And man always just has to learn to live with it and work his way out of it. Think of the oil embargo in 1973, and then we hit that little, what they called a mini recession then. And finally, it seems like Reaganomics, although left-wing liberal media doesn't like that right-wing term and concept there, Reaganomics has done something to get us out of it. Reagan has done something well, and that's why we're always praising God for our leaders. Now, if he gave us a bad one, well, we'd praise him anyway. But how much the more if we've got a good leader, though? Praise God. You may have to start paying less in taxes now the next few years. Now, wouldn't that be a blessing? You've been reading about that, right? I mean, I've already figured out for ourselves, it means savings for us. I don't know, maybe you make so much it means more for you, but it means savings for us. Praise God. You've been keeping up the greatest tax overhaul in the history of our country. That's going to be in textbooks for your grandchildren to study if the world is still here. And so we're living, we think, no big deal right now, no big deal. It is a big deal. It's a very big deal. Wait till it comes time to pay taxes in a few years from now and see if it doesn't go down. Well, let's jump to another reason. Another reason why they would have recession or inflation would be the subject of war. Now, I think these would be the two biggest reasons, and again, I'm not trying to be too technical or too advanced or go into too much detail. And I could say more than this, but we'll say more in some other study. These would be the two biggest reasons behind recession and inflation. Not stock market crashed or something. Climate and war. All right, let's take a look at the best example in the Bible would be 2 Kings chapter 6. In any extended war, such as the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity, would usher in this exact same thing. But let's look at the best example because it's specified so well in the end of 2 Kings 6 and all of 2 Kings chapter 7. This is the scripture about dove's dung and the head of an ass, about how much they would cost. All right, we're talking about recession, inflation then. Let's see, beginning with verse 24. 2 Kings 6 and verse 24. Now, I know we're looking way back in the Old Testament, but the same thing would be true in the New as well. I mean, whenever you have war, you have men taken away from farming, you have men taken away from fishing, you have men taken away from whatever their livelihood, whatever their occupation was. You have men taken away from that. And then as a result of that, you're going to have problems. Think of World War II here in this country. That's what got women into the workforce. It wasn't ERA in the 1960s, it was the Second World War. Who are the ones who made all those submarines and made all those airplanes and made all those boats? Have you done any reading in American history? Women made those submarines and made those boats and put those airplanes together. All the boys were gone. They were overseas then. Women put all those things together. And that put women into the workforce, and they've been there ever since. I'm not pronouncing judgment on that. I'm not saying pro or con about that. I'm just saying historically that's how they got there, not ERA. Again, if you are... Let's say what? If you're under 30, we could even say maybe under 35. Yeah, we could say maybe under 40. If you're under 40 and you just have been brought up but you don't read or study anything, then you're indoctrinated by the left-wing liberals' media's views about things today. And all you can think of is the time in which you've been brought up, and that only makes sense. You've been brought up in the 50s, the late 50s or early 50s, and the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And then you forget about a few things a little bit earlier than that. 60s ERA, that was nothing. It was World War II. But anyway, my point was war. What happened there? Nylon stockings? They were at a premium in those days. Sugar, gasoline, rubber for automobile tires, just automobiles were at a premium from 1939 to 1945 here in this country. I hope I'm not talking over your head historically here in American history. But what happened right after World War II? Boom years in this country then. All the men come back home. Now the women are already trained. A lot of them stay on the job. And now you have all of this new industry that's been created, especially in the military, which calls for more openings and jobs, which calls for more men to fill them. which just gave us a tremendous boost in our economy then. Sometimes you have a boost afterwards. We're talking about during the war, though. I mean, that's even true today. During the war, you have a strain and a stress placed upon your country because you enter a period of straits. Even Vietnam War, but nothing like World War II. World War I even was nothing like World War II. World War II was tremendous. That was, well, here I go again on all these side topics. That was the greatest war in the history of the world. 50 million people were killed in the Second World War. 50 million people. Now, what did we lose in Vietnam? 50,000. We lost 50,000 men in Vietnam, and not that many men in Korea. 50 million people were killed in the Second World War. It's the greatest war that's ever been fought. Most people are kind of hoping we'll never have a third world war. If that was the Second World War and it increased over the casualties of the First World War, think what the Third World War would hold. Something like maybe the book of Revelation teaches a third of the earth's population will die, and then a third of the two-thirds that is remaining will die. That is in the billions, not in the 50 millions. That is in the billions of people that will die. See how it helps to know other things, then you can put other things in proper perspective then. Well, anyway, it came to pass, verse 24, after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, gathered all his host and went up and besieged Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria. Okay, we're back to famines and droughts. They're the things that cause recessions and inflation. But here the famine's not caused by climatic considerations, but by a siege. They are blockaded in the city now.
For the continuation.
But here the famine's not caused by climatic considerations, but by a siege. They are blockaded in the city now. There came a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until an ass's head was sold for 4 fried brains would taste pretty good if you had nothing else to eat with. Well, you just came from supper. You're not going to it, hopefully. An ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver. Well, we don't know how much that was, but however much it was pay for a donkey's head, that's for sure. And the 4th part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver. That's not as expensive as an ass's head, but I would rather eat the ass's head, though. That's just, I mean, what a meal. What are we having for supper tonight? Beer, dove's dung, and a donkey's head. Even a casserole would beat that. And as the king of Israel was passing by upon the wall, there cried unto him a woman saying, Help, my lord, O king. And he said, If the Lord can't help you, then how can I help you? That's what I say in counseling sessions. If God can't help you, how could I? Anyway, the king said, this is a pagan king, though. What aileth thee? She answered, This woman said unto me, Give thy son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son, and we eat him. And I said to her on the next day, Give thy son, that we may eat him. And she was smart. She hid him. She hid her neighbor's son and hid her own. It's a pretty smart thing to do. I don't know. I've never had human flesh, and I would never want to have human flesh. I don't know how that would compare to dove's dung or an ass's head. But according to Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, this was a sign of the covenantal displeasure of God upon his people. He said, We know that I've forsaken you whenever you resort to your own children. And it happened here, or it happened over there. It happened in Jeremiah's book, Book of Lamentations, chapter 5, or chapter 4 speaks of that. Lamentations chapter 4, it happened during the Babylonian captivity, 586 BC. It happened more than these 2 times in Israel's Old Testament history. And so anyway, let's keep on with our point here. Jumping down to the next chapter, the first verse. produce recession and inflation in the land of Israel. All right, look at verse 10. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and he came to the gate of the city, and behold, the widow woman was there gathering sticks, probably plenty of those around with dead trees, plenty of sticks to gather. And he called her and said, Fetch me, I pray thee, a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And as she was going to fetch it, she must have had a little water stored up. He called to her and said, And bring me a morsel of bread. You know, I'm hungry and thirsty, or thirsty and hungry, to get it in his order. And she says, The Lord thy God liveth, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel, and a little oil in a cruse. Behold, I am gathering 2 sticks, that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said unto her, Fear not, go and do as thou hast said, but make me thereof a little cake first, and bring it unto me, and after make for thee and for thy son. Now, she had a faith that it would behoove us in the church to have, and she was a pagan woman who hardly knew anything about God or true religion. Well, look at the type of faith she had. This was her last meal. And here this bearded nomad is wandering in, prophesying these various things to her in ecstasy, and she believes him. And she's blessed as a result of that. Jesus, remember, uses that example in his hometown Nazareth whenever he preached his sermon there in Luke chapter 4. So there were many widows in the land of Israel in the days of Elijah. And Elijah was sent to none of them except to the woman, the widow of Zarephath. In other words, he was trying to say something about his own ministry. I'm not going to come to you people living in Nazareth here. I'm going to go to other places. There will be other people that I can reach more easily than I can reach you. Because a prophet, he said, is not without honor, but in his own house, in his own country, and among his own kin. And of course, they took up stones and tried to kill him, throwing him off the brow of the hill upon which their city was built, whenever he gave this reference here to Gentiles because of how strong they were ethnically and racially. Bring it unto me, and after make for thee and for thy son. For thus saith the Lord God of Israel, The barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth. See, it's a lack of rain. But the author of 1 Kings, whoever that might have been, expects for us to understand the reason, the cause behind this. It wasn't because there weren't any clouds around. It wasn't because they didn't have any rain. They didn't have any rain because it didn't rain. Well, that makes a lot of sense, but why didn't they have rain, though? It's because God had withheld it. She went and did according to the saying of Elijah, and she and he and her house did eat for many days. And the barrel of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Elijah. All right, then if you jump over into chapter 18, verses 3 and 4. See, the same thing here, and we're saying that the Old Testament writers and authors saw an important spiritual reason behind such problems. They traced it back to covenantal disobedience. Ahab called Obadiah, not our Obadiah of the minor prophets, but another one, which was the governor of his house. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. For it was so, when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, that Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50 in a cave and fed them with bread and water. When she cut off the prophets of the Lord, that is, when she cut off their supply. Remember, she had a court with many hosts of prophets, false prophets, prophets of Baal. She had many prophets in her court, and all the prophets there would have to be fed from her table. Well, she cut the true prophets of the Lord off. The true prophets were the ones of the Lord. And so Obadiah had to sneak them out and hide them in caves and somehow find some bread and water to feed them. And then, maybe more clearly than in 1 Kings, you can see it in 2 Samuel chapter 21. That recession and inflation were just common. We're talking about the economic background to the period between the Testaments, which is common in Old Testament times and in New Testament times, as well as the times in between. Just common, due to these two reasons, the climate and war. And we're just looking now a little more deeply behind it as to what they thought about these events. Then there was a famine in the days of David. Now, just about all the time, if we see a famine, you can simply read in before that a drought. What causes the famine? A drought. 3 years, year after year, just about as long as the one with Elijah and Obadiah. And David inquired of the Lord. In other words, he thought, and correctly so, there's some spiritual cause behind this. We can't just say, well, that's just the way Mother Nature is. She's fairly fickle sometimes out there. David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, it is because of Saul, for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. Remember, Israel had made a covenant way back in the days of Joshua. Those were the people who tricked them and said, we've come from a far country. Look at our molded bread and our worn-out wineskins and our worn-out shoes. And they didn't inquire of the Lord then. They believed them instead of inquiring of the Lord. And they swear to them, we'll never conquer you then. We'll make you our water drawers and our wood bringers. You'll cut our wood and draw our water for us. Well, they had been brought into a relationship according to the elders of Israel, led by Joshua back then. And so Saul has no right killing these people, the Gibeonites. If you read in the early chapters, like chapter, 8, I believe, in the book of Joshua. And so Saul had gone out and murdered some of these. And again, that means he had broken God's covenant and his covenant with God. And as a result, God brought something upon the people. The Lord answered, it is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. Which only goes to show that, yes, the righteous can also be living in the southeastern United States today and still be experiencing famine. They can be experiencing it because it's coming on the wicked that are around them. There's some reason behind that. There's some cause. Things just don't happen. There has to be a deeper reason. If we believe in a sovereign God who has predetermined all events that are to come to pass, there's a reason behind that. There has to be something deeper behind that. Say, well, now, wait a minute. Saying that the righteous, and David was one of the righteous are going to have to be living in the midst of the famine as well. Well, of course, God can hardly withhold rain on your or their acre and give rain on your acre, and it'd be like a patchwork quilt when you look down from the skies, where the raindrops fell and they were supernaturally brought over here and then diverted from this farm or from this area over here. It's Matthew 5. God sends his rains on the just and the unjust and causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. Those that thank God and those that don't thank him experience the same thing. Well, lest we be concerned or lest we be afraid, God gives us promises, such as over in Psalm 37 and verse 19, that in the days of famine, the righteous will be satisfied. We have to have promises like that, or God would be killing us with the wicked. And the case of Elijah and Obadiah and all the Lord's prophets are a good example. Is a good example. 1 Kings 17 and 18, that's a good example there. In the days of famine, they shall be satisfied. Psalm 37:19. Okay, so I guess that's a big enough look at recession and inflation. As long as you kind of keep that in your mind, that they could experience the same thing in the period between the Testaments and could experience the same things in the first century as well. And Acts 11 shows that. Okay, let's move on down to occupations then. Look at industry and agriculture. Industry was practically non-existent. Industry as we know it is a product of what we call the Industrial Revolution and its automation. Prior to that, the vast majority of things in the world were what we call a mom-and-pop operation, a family-centered, family-oriented, a family-run affair. And today, that's kind of the aesthetic thing to do, is to go back to a mom-and-pop deal, where you don't have all the big-time business that you have to deal with. Well, in those days, it wasn't a question of let's return to the mom-and-pop country store ideal. That was just the way most things were. 90% or more of things back then were a mom-and-pop, family-run, husband and wife, father and oldest two sons, or whatever, run operation. Industry was practically non-existent. Now, there were some exceptions. There were some exceptions. First of all, let's look in the area of slavery. The great forced building projects, such as the pyramids, I don't know that we can really look at that as industry. We'll just mention it now as such, because of the great number of people involved in it. See, we're saying most things had very few people involved. Again, it's just an area in which it's difficult for ourselves to relate because we're so far removed from that. It takes so many different items just to live a day now. Look around your You've got so many different items, and then take apart each item that you have, that little bottle of whatever it has in it, suntan lotion, and then the bottle, that plastic had to be formed somewhere, had to be made somewhere, formed into a bottle, and the ingredients had to be made. Then it had to be put in the bottle, and then it had to be stamped. And then it took offices and everything to run all of that, and machines, and it took mechanics to operate the machines whenever they broke down. It took women to sit there with little nets on their head so no hair would fall down in there, and you would pour some out and get some hair out of there. You know how all that goes. It took women to operate the little conveyor belts, and then it took a big semi-truck to back in there, and someone to drive a forklift, and someone had to make that forklift, and someone had to make the pallet upon which all of the cases were stacked, and someone had to make the cardboard boxes that all of this was packaged in, and it was lifted up, and someone, where did we get the gasoline for, and the truck driver, and then who made the interstates out there? You see, you just take a little bottle of suntan lotion, and you could probably easily think up 50 different ways or people or things that went into the making of that little thing. Olden days, you want to get a suntan, you went out in the sun. It took one thing. There was sun out there, and that's how you got it. Now, with all of this stuff, look around with the things that we have on here, the clothes and the furniture and what. It's an incredible world in which we live. It's a very exceedingly broad world in which we live. In those days, everything is different. It's so difficult for us to look at things like that. But you take that little illustration I just gave and just keep on working that out. All right? And then it's got to go to a supermarket. I'll finish working it out. It's so much fun. Then it's got to go to a supermarket. And, someone's got to control that. And we got to have some stock boys to stock all the stuff. And who made the cash registers to register whenever you go through. And the government made your money so you can pay for that. And you take it home. And you got to have a suntan lotion cabinet to store it in somewhere, and then that's in a room, and then that took some wood, some 2x4s and sheetrock to build that room, and that took some laborers to build that, and they had to get there in a truck to get there. All right, you see? Incredible! Just to get that home, and then to ever use it. And especially if you go to a beach, and then took a bulldozer to make the beach, and then someone sits in a little booth there and collects your money as you come through, and then you had to buy a lawn chair. And who made that lawn chair? All right, let's go back again. Who made that lawn chair then? All right, industry back then was practically non-existent. Industry today, it just controls everything. I mean, it's good. It's a return. This is what a lot of people are wanting to do. Let's return to the mom and pop operations. And even that, still industry is involved, because look at that store, what it's stocked with. Where did they get all that? Mom and pop didn't make all of that. They got that from someone else. But at least it's mom and pop, and you're not dealing with numbers. At least you're back with faces again. It's not a toll-free number, and you call them, and they'll call someone, they'll ship it out over here, and then they'll talk to someone, and they'll drop it by your place. And it's so impersonal. Everything is so impersonal. And those days, things were very personal. Sometimes they were too personal. Well, the great building projects, the pyramids, the building of the temple in Jerusalem, was built by slaves, other people as well. Some Israelites had something to do with that. Most Israelites, remember, were not slaves in the first century. But if you want to talk about something on a large scale, really not industry as far as I'm concerned with my understanding of industry, but on a large scale, there is something. Let's fit some other things here that more properly fit under industry. Industry. And by industry, again, I'm meaning a large number of people involved in the production of something. All right, what about shipping on the Mediterranean? Shipping was an important industry in the 1st century A.D. It had been important for centuries back in the Old Testament era. I've got several big things here that are important. Shipping on the Mediterranean. What about the book of Jonah? Jonah chapter 1, Jonah gets on a ship, remember? He's fleeing from the presence of the Lord. He heads from Joppa over to Tarshish. I wonder what that ship is doing out there. It's involved in industry. Think of all the men it takes. Those are back in the days of the sailing ships, and whenever you didn't have a wind, you had things called oars, and you'd start paddling back in those days. You have a lot of people there involved in that. A lot of deckhands involved in that. Well, semi-industry for you. In Acts chapter 27, Paul gets on a grain ship of Adramyttium that evidently has brought grain from Egypt, which was the bread basket for Italy and for Rome, and of course was headed to Rome. Paul, having appealed to Caesar, was in like manner himself headed to the capital city of Rome. That's Acts 27, shipping on the Mediterranean. The best passage that we have is Ezekiel chapter 27. And one of those Phoenician cities, I believe it's Tyre. Tyre was a famous shipping city. All of Ezekiel 27. Let's just read a little bit of it to catch the flavor. The word of the Lord came again unto me, saying, Now thou son of man, take up a lamentation for Tyrus, and say unto Tyre, O thou that art situate at the entry of the sea, which art a merchant of the people for many isles. All right, shipping on the Mediterranean was very, very important. Thus saith the Lord God, O Tyre, thou hast said, I am of perfect beauty, thy borders in the midst of the seas. They've made all thy shipboards of fir trees. All right, now there's somewhat industry, shipbuilding, but that's part of seagoing trade on the Mediterranean, you see. But someone's going to have to make these ships, and it'd take a number of people to put one of these boats together. Anyway, they've made all thy shipboards of fir trees of Senir. They have taken cedars from Lebanon to make masts for thee. You know, the mast that would support all the rigging and the sails for the ship. So we've got two different types of boards, fir trees and cedars. Well, there's some industry involved right there. Of the oaks of Bashan have they made thine oars. The company of the Ashurites have made thy benches of ivory. Out of the isles of Kittim, fine linen with broidered work from Egypt was that which spreadest forth thy sail. See all the industry involved? This would be a major thing. And it certainly was still true in the 1st century, as Acts 27 shows.
This message will be continued